At my daughter's wedding, she lifted her champagne flute, her voice full of sweetness that cut like a knife. "To a real father," she declared, pointing not at me, but at her father-in-law. The room applauded as if I didn't exist. My chest tightened, but instead of crumbling, I raised my own glass. What I said next drained the color from the bride and groom's faces and turned the entire reception on its head. Before I continue, please subscribe to the channel and tell me in the comments, what would you do if your own daughter publicly replaced you with another man at her wedding? The applause had not even settled when I felt the sting of her words tear straight through me. My daughter, my Clara, had just called another man her real father in front of 300 guests. The chandeliers sparkled overhead, the walls of Crescent Pavilion gleamed with wealth, and the photographers captured every angle of her polished smile as she lifted her glass toward Victor Hale. Not once did her eyes drift toward me. I sat at table 12, far from the head table, my glass of water sweating against my palm, my heart heavier than the cheap suit I wore. The guests clapped and murmured their approval, their voices rising like a tide that threatened to drown me in humiliation. Victor basked in the moment, his silver hair catching the light, his posture unshaken by the fact that he had only just met my daughter a year earlier. He raised his flute in return, as if he had earned that title, as if he had carried Clara through scraped knees, late-night fevers, and the countless small battles that come with raising a child. My throat burned, but I did not move. I could feel my pulse pounding in my temples, and still I forced myself to breathe slowly, evenly, refusing to show weakness. Years of sacrifice pressed on me in that moment. The kidney I had given, the money I had spent, the nights I had sat up while my wife fought for her life. Every piece of myself I had poured into making sure Clara had a chance at a future. All of it was erased with a single sentence. She had crowned Victor Hale the father she wished she had, and she had done it in front of every powerful family in Riverton. The clapping swelled again before fading to an expectant hush. Clara's smile froze when I rose from my chair. The scrape of wood against polished floor turned heads my way. For the first time all night, people noticed the forgotten man at the edge of the room. I could feel their eyes on me, weighing my cheap suit against the designer gowns, my lined face against the painted masks of prosperity. I lifted my glass, plain water in a tumbler, nothing like the champagne the others held. Yet in that moment, it felt heavier than gold. "I would like to raise a glass as well," I said, my voice carrying into the silence. No microphone, no stage, but every syllable cut through the air clean and sharp. Some shifted in their seats, curious. Others looked uncomfortable, sensing tension. Clara turned her face toward me at last. Her eyes flickered wide just for an instant before she composed herself again. I caught it, that brief flash of fear. She knew what I was capable of saying. She knew the truth I carried in my bones, the truth she had always chosen to ignore. I took one step forward, letting my gaze sweep across the hall. "I want to raise this glass to something real," I said. "To love that does not count its value in jewels, or estates, or banquet halls. To love that is tested in the dark when there is nothing left but the will to give." Victor shifted in his seat. His wife Alice clutched her pearls a little tighter. Richard, my new son-in-law, looked from me to Clara and back again, his nervous fingers twisting at the wedding band on his hand. Clara's grip around her champagne flute tightened until her knuckles turned pale against the stem. "There are many kinds of fathers," I went on, my voice steady. "But the truest is not the one who buys affection with gifts or steps into a role when the work is already done. The truest is the one who sacrifices, who gives of himself when it costs more than he can spare. Whispers ran through the tables. Some of the older guests, those who had known me when my wife was still alive, began to glance at one another, their brows furrowing. Recognition was dawning in their eyes. They remembered the long hospital stays, the quiet rumors of a father who had nearly lost his own life to save someone he loved. Clara's composure began to crack. A faint tremor touched her jaw. She knew where I was going, and she was praying silently that I would stop. I looked directly at her, not at Victor, not at Richard, but at the daughter who had once curled into my lap and whispered secrets only a child could trust a father with. Her eyes met mine for the briefest moment before she looked away, fixing her gaze on the crystal chandelier above her head as if its brightness could shield her from the truth. "This," I said slowly, raising my glass higher, "is a toast Clara will never forget." The silence deepened, thick enough to choke on. I could see the tension ripple through the crowd, the shifting of gowns against chairs, the nervous clearing of throats. Even the waiters paused mid-step, trays suspended in the air, sensing the weight of what was unfolding. All the polished wealth in that room suddenly looked brittle, fragile, compared to what I carried in my heart. Clara squeezed Richard's hand beneath the table, her lips pressing into a thin line. Victor's eyes narrowed, measuring me like an opponent across a battlefield. Alice dabbed at her temple with a napkin, her skin pale under the golden lights. Richard himself sat frozen, caught between loyalty to his bride and the undeniable curiosity of what I was about to say. I let the silence stretch, because silence can be more powerful than any shout. I wanted Clara to feel every second of it, to know that I held her entire facade in my hands. For 20 years, I had buried the truth. I had kept it hidden out of love, out of protection, out of a father's instinct to shield his child from harsh realities. But in that moment, in that glittering hall filled with wealth and pride, I knew that silence was no longer love. Silence had become complicity. I would not be erased, not tonight, not after all that had been taken from me. I lowered my glass slightly, my hand steady despite the tremor that sometimes betrayed me after surgery. My body had never fully recovered, but my resolve had never been stronger. I was no longer the man who endured humiliation quietly. I was no longer the father who let his daughter believe her betrayal could go unanswered. I leaned forward, my voice steady as steel. "And before this night ends," I said, letting my gaze burn into Clara's, "every one of you will understand what a real father is." Those words still echoed in my chest as I remembered the moment 2 months earlier when Clara had stormed into my kitchen and shattered the fragile bond we had left. It had been a quiet Tuesday afternoon. The spring light filtered weakly through the worn curtains above my sink, catching dust motes that swirled lazily in the air. I had been hunched over the kitchen table sorting bills, my reading glasses sliding down my nose, when the front door flew open without so much as a knock. "Dad?" Clara had announced, her voice sharp with the confidence of someone who never waited for permission. The heels of her shoes struck the linoleum like a gavel, each step a verdict against the simple life I had built. She set her leather purse, a brand I could never afford, even if I saved for a year, on the table, scattering the bills I had been organizing into a messy fan across the surface. Her diamond ring flashed deliberately as she waved her left hand under my nose. "I am getting married. The date is June 6th. The wedding will be at Crescent Pavilion, and I need at least $25,000 from you." I had blinked, still holding the electric bill in my hand, the numbers on the page blurring as if they no longer mattered in the shadow of her demand. Clara stood before me in clothes that probably cost more than my monthly grocery budget. She was 34 years old, dressed like a magazine cover, every inch of her polished and expensive. The diamond on her finger had to be 4 carats at least, and she twisted it slightly so the light caught the cut, sending beams across the room like tiny spears. 25,000, I repeated quietly, setting the bill down with deliberate care. That is a great deal of money, Clara. Her lips pressed into a thin line, the way they always had when she thought I was being deliberately difficult. It is not a great deal compared to the Hale family, she snapped. Richard's parents expect a proper wedding. They are inviting their business partners, politicians, everyone who matters. The Hales own half of Riverton's commercial district. Do you want them to see me walking down the aisle in some rented hall with plastic chairs? She paced the narrow kitchen as though the space itself insulted her, her expensive perfume overwhelming the familiar scent of coffee and wood polish. I watched her as she moved, her designer heels clicking against the worn floor, her silk blouse glinting in the sunlight that slipped past the curtains. She looked like she belonged to another world entirely, one I had never been part of and never would be. I stood slowly, my joints aching from the surgery that had taken more from me than I would ever admit to her. My body was weaker now, my movement slower, but my voice remained steady. Let me check what I've saved. Her eyes rolled with impatience as I reached for the old bank book tucked behind the sugar canister on the shelf. The booklet was frayed at the edges, its pages thin from years of careful handling. I flipped it open and saw the final entry. 6,000 and a few dollars more. 3 years of scrimping, saving, counting every penny twice. I held it out to her with a quiet pride. I have a little over 6,000. It is not 25, but perhaps we can plan something beautiful within that. Clara snatched the book from my hand. Her manicured nails scratched the cover as she flipped through the pages with growing disgust. 6,000, she hissed. That will barely cover the flowers. Do you want me to be humiliated in front of the Hales? Do you want them to think I come from nothing? The booklet slipped from her hands and clattered to the floor. Pages scattered across the linoleum, the fragile record of my sacrifices lying under her expensive shoes. She crossed her arms, her mouth curling into a sneer. They will think I have a loser for a father. The word struck harder than any physical blow. I stared at her, trying to reconcile the demanding woman before me with the little girl who used to climb into my lap and beg me to tell her stories until she fell asleep. My throat tightened as memories crashed against the present like waves against rock. I bent to gather the bank book, my knees stiff, my hands shaking slightly as I collected the scattered pages. Clara, I said quietly, I know it is not the number you hoped for, but I gave everything to your mother's treatments. Every dollar went into keeping her alive as long as possible. That is why there is so little now. She laughed, a cold sound that felt sharper than any knife. Oh, please, do not start with that again. I am tired of hearing about your excuses. Richard's father owns 3 appliance stores, and his mother drives a Mercedes. What am I supposed to tell them about you? That my father wasted his life in a repair shop and bankrupted himself over medical bills? I looked at her in silence for a moment, the weight of her cruelty pressing down on me. Through the kitchen window, I saw her sleek imported car parked beside my 20-year-old pickup truck. The contrast between the two vehicles told the story better than any words could. She checked her diamond-studded watch with exaggerated impatience, the motion theatrical. "I do not have time for this poverty routine, Dad. Either figure something out, or I will ask Richard's family to cover the costs themselves." She gathered her purse and smoothed her blouse, every movement dripping with disdain. The afternoon sun slanted through the curtains, highlighting the gulf between her and me, a gulf she seemed determined to widen. She paused at the doorway, her voice dropping into something colder, sharper. "Do you know what the worst part is? I thought maybe, just this once, you could actually come through for me. Instead, you are disappointing me again." My throat ached. "I am trying to help," I said quietly. "Maybe if we looked at a smaller venue or cut down the guest list." Her eyes flashed. Richard's sister had her reception at the Riverton Country Club. 300 guests, live orchestra, imported flowers. That is the standard. That is the world I belong in. I am 34 years old, Dad, and this is my chance at real happiness. Do you not want that for me?" I wanted to tell her that I had already given her happiness. I wanted to remind her of the years I worked double shifts, the nights I came home too tired to stand, but still managed to carry her upstairs to bed. I wanted to remind her of the kidney I gave, of the scars I still bore, of the wife I lost while trying to keep her alive long enough for Clara to have a mother. But she was not listening. She never listened. Clara smoothed her hair, her voice calm again, almost casual. "Richard's family is worth millions. His father creates jobs, owns property all over Riverton. His mother collects art. They are going to be my family now. My real family." The words sliced through me. My hand tightened on the back of the chair to steady myself as dizziness swept over me. "What does that mean exactly?" My voice came out hoarse. She met my eyes without flinching. Her smile was sharp enough to wound. "It means I am going to have a father who can actually provide for me. A real father. Richard Hale, Sr." Those words did not just land in the kitchen that afternoon. They stayed with me for weeks, echoing in my mind like a cruel refrain I could not silence. Every time I tried to sleep, I saw Clara's face as she said them. So certain, so unbothered by the pain she knew she was causing. It was not a careless remark. It was deliberate, meant to wound, meant to sever the last threads of loyalty I thought she still held for me. And in that instant, I knew she believed it. She truly believed the blood in her veins meant less than the money that lined the Hale family's pockets. After she left, slamming the door so hard that a picture frame rattled on the wall, I sat at the kitchen table with the scattered bills around me. The old bank book lay open, its thin pages curling at the edges. I pushed it aside and pulled out the thick folder I kept in the bottom drawer, the one I tried not to open unless I had to. It was heavy with papers, receipts, payment schedules, and hospital records. The sight of it alone brought back the smell of antiseptic, the faint beep of machines in hospital rooms, the hollow ache of watching someone you love slip away despite everything you do. I opened the folder and spread the pages across the table. Chemotherapy receipts, radiation bills, records of experimental drugs the insurance had refused to cover. Every page told a story of desperation. My wife's handwriting appeared on some of them, shaky but determined, signing agreements that kept us afloat just long enough for another round of treatment. The numbers swam before my eyes. 80,000, 90,000, 100,000. Numbers that had no business being attached to survival. Numbers that stripped us bare financially while giving us only the smallest extension of time. I leaned back in my chair, the weight of memory pressing on me. I remembered the night she had cried in her hospital bed, whispering that she was sorry, that she wished she were not such a burden. I had taken her hand, placed it against my chest, and told her she was never a burden. She was my wife, my partner, the only person I had ever truly belonged to. If it meant selling every tool I owned, draining every account, I would do it again. I had done it gladly. That was what love meant. Love was not measured in the size of the wedding hall or the brand of a car. Love was measured in what you were willing to lose so someone else could live. Clara never understood that. Or perhaps she chose not to. She was too busy reaching for a future she believed would erase the past. But as I stared at those papers, I felt the old bitterness I had fought to bury come creeping back. The sacrifices I made were invisible to her. The scars I carried, the hollow in my side from the surgery where I had given part of myself away, they were nothing to her compared to the sparkle of Richard Hale's cufflinks or the glint of his wife's jewelry. It was not the first time Clara had dismissed sacrifice. My eyes drifted toward the bookshelf across the room where I kept the photo albums. I rose stiffly and pulled one down, the leather cover worn soft from years of handling. I opened it to the section marked with a folded slip of paper, and there she was. Clara, at 28 years old, radiant in white lace, standing next to her first husband, Alan. He had been a good man, an accountant with steady work and kind eyes that lit up when he looked at her. I remembered the first dinner we shared after their engagement. Alan had insisted on paying for everyone, had pulled out my wife's chair, had even stayed late to help me fix a loose hinge on the back door. I had liked him immediately. Their wedding had been modest compared to what Clara wanted now, but beautiful all the same. A small church, fresh flowers, a reception at a local hall filled with family laughter. My wife had cried tears of joy, squeezing my hand as Clara danced her first dance as a bride. I had thought then that my daughter was stepping into a life of stability and kindness. For 2 years, it seemed true. But the whispers had started not long after. I heard them from Alan's sister at the grocery store, from old neighbors who spoke in careful tones. Clara had drained their joint accounts, had racked up charges on credit cards, had insisted on vacations and purchases Alan could not sustain. When the divorce papers were filed, the notice in the Riverton Herald cited irreconcilable differences. But I knew better. I had seen the way Clara smirked when the settlement check arrived. I had sat in this very kitchen as she sipped coffee and said, "Men are foolish to trust women with their money." Alan never saw it coming. At the time, I told myself it was bitterness speaking, the voice of someone hurt and humiliated. But now, with years of distance, I could see it clearly. That had not been bitterness. That had been truth. Clara had revealed herself that day, and I had refused to see it. I wanted to believe she was still the little girl who had clutched my hand at the county fair, who had begged me to lift her onto my shoulders so she could see the fireworks. I wanted to believe there was innocence left in her. But her words had been a confession. And now, watching her prepare to marry into the Hale family, I realized Alan had only been the first step. Clara had turned marriage into a transaction. Love was a facade she wore like a dress, but money was the only partner she truly committed to. She had found Richard Hale, a man with wealth in his bloodline and a father who controlled an empire. It was perfect for her. She would charm him, she would smile for the cameras, and behind it all, she would be calculating what his family's fortune could give her. I shut the photo album and placed it back on the shelf, my hands trembling slightly. The truth was undeniable now. Clara was not chasing love. She was chasing prey. And the Hales, powerful as they were, had no idea what kind of predator they were welcoming into their home. I sat back down at the table and stared at the spread of bills and hospital records. The silent testimony of a life spent giving. My wife's smile stared up at me from a faded photograph propped against the wall, her eyes full of trust and hope. She had believed in me, even when we had nothing left. And I had delivered, even when it nearly killed me. Clara had chosen to erase that history, but I could not allow her to erase it for everyone else. If the Hale family believed they were gaining a perfect daughter-in-law, if Richard himself believed he was marrying for love, then they deserved to know the truth. They deserved to see the pattern before it consumed them. I could not stop Clara from making her choices, but I could stop her from destroying another good man and bleeding another family dry. I gathered the papers into the folder, stacked the bills neatly, and pushed them aside. For the first time in a long while, my resolve hardened into something sharp. I was done being passive. I was done letting Clara's cruelty go unchallenged. I picked up a pen and a notebook, flipped to a clean page, and wrote a name at the top in bold letters. Richard Hale. For the next week, that notebook became my constant companion. I carried it from the kitchen to my study, filling page after page with notes, dates, and fragments of information I could piece together from newspapers, directories, and old acquaintances who had lived in Riverton long enough to know the Hales by reputation, if not in person. It did not take long to see the reach of their name. Half the downtown commercial blocks carried deeds tied back to Hale Holdings. The Riverton Journal ran stories about Richard Hale Sr.'s sponsorship of charity events and community programs. Photographs showed him shaking hands with mayors and business owners, always in the same immaculate suit, always with that same confident smile of a man who knew he controlled the ground under everyone else's feet. His company, Hale Agricultural Equipment, had 3 major dealerships spread across the county, employing more than 50 people. Their machines worked the fields, built the barns, and kept the local farms running. If the hospital was Riverton's heart, the Hales were its muscle. Every farmer owed them something. Every store depended on the money that filtered through their contracts. They were the kind of family who appeared generous, but whose generosity always seemed to make them richer in the end. I read until my eyes burned, until the print blurred, until the photographs all started to look the same. But it was not Richard Sr. I needed to understand. It was his son, my future son-in-law, Richard Jr. He was the one Clara had chosen, the one she planned to tie herself to, the one she would eventually hollow out the way she had hollowed Alan. There was not much about him in the papers. He appeared at ribbon cuttings, at business dinners, but always in the background. A nervous smile, a polite handshake. Never the commanding presence of his father. I dug deeper. The business directory listed him as assistant manager at the downtown dealership. I underlined the address in my notebook 3 times. If he was there, then that was where I would begin. The following Thursday, I drove my old pickup into Riverton's downtown. The truck rattled over the uneven asphalt, its faded paint and dented bumper drawing stares from pedestrians used to gleaming sedans and polished SUVs. I parked across the street from Hale Agricultural's main office, a modern building of glass and brick that towered above the surrounding shops. Company. Trucks lined the lot, each one newer than anything I had ever driven. Beside them sat a black Mercedes and a silver BMW. The Hale family cars, no doubt. I sat in my truck for a long time, staring at the building, the logo painted large above the entrance. This was their fortress, and my daughter was trying to marry her way inside. My stomach growled. I had left the house without breakfast. Across the street, a small diner's neon sign flickered in the morning light. I locked my truck and walked inside, the bell above the door jingling as I stepped onto the checkered tile floor. The place smelled of coffee, bacon, and old grease. Farmers in dusty jeans crowded the booths, their conversations overlapping in the comfortable hum of a town where everyone knew everyone's business. I slid onto a stool at the counter. A waitress with tired eyes and a quick smile approached, holding a pot of coffee. "Black?" she asked. "Yes, please," I said. And she poured, glancing at my worn flannel shirt before naming the price. I pulled a couple of singles from my wallet, careful not to let the stack of overdue bills tucked inside slip into view. Through the diner's front window, I could see the Hale building across the street. I gestured toward it with my chin. Quite an operation they run over there. The waitress brightened, eager to share. "Hale Agricultural, biggest employer in town after the hospital. Richard Sr. practically owns this whole block, sponsors the parade every year. Paid for new uniforms at the high school, too. Everyone here owes him something." I nodded, sipping my coffee. "And the son? Richard Jr.? Her face softened into something less certain. She leaned on the counter, lowering her voice. "He is different, quiet, kind of nervous. My boyfriend works in the parts department, says Junior's polite, but, well, not like his father. Senior commands the room, Junior avoids it." That was all I needed to hear. A weakness, a crack. Clara knew it too, I was certain. She had picked Alan once because he was steady, trusting, predictable. When that fell apart, she found another man with the same flaws, only this time backed by a family fortune large enough to keep her satisfied. I finished my coffee, left a small tip, and stepped back into the morning sun. My feet carried me to the hardware store next door, where an older man was arranging a display of tools outside. I picked up a box of screws I did not need and nodded to him. "Morning." He returned the gesture with a smile. His hands were weathered, his back stooped, but his eyes were sharp. "Morning." I held up the box casually. "Heard there's going to be a big wedding soon. The Hale boy." The man chuckled, leaning on the display. "About time, too. Junior is 32, still living at home. His parents have been pushing him to find a wife for years. Lucky girl marrying into that family. Richest folks in 3 counties, no doubt about it." I paid for the screws and asked one more question as I tucked them into my pocket. "What kind of man is he in your opinion?" The old man shrugged. "Not a bad one, just soft. Always seemed like he needed someone to make decisions for him." That sealed it. Clara had found her perfect mark. A man too weak to resist, too eager to please, too overshadowed by his father to ever assert himself. She would use him, the way she had used Alan, and when she was done, she would move on, richer, colder, and more dangerous. I returned to my truck, pulled out my notebook, and wrote it down in thick letters. Soft. Needs someone to decide for him. The page filled slowly as I recorded every detail, every rumor, every observation. When I looked up again, the sun was higher in the sky, gleaming off the Hale building's windows. It was time to stop circling, time to step inside. I dialed the number listed in the directory. The phone rang 3 times before an uncertain male voice answered. "Hale Agricultural Equipment. This is Richard." I gripped the notebook tighter. "Richard, this is David Thompson, Clara's father." Silence stretched for a moment. When he spoke again, his voice was nervous, cautious. "Oh, Mr. Thompson. Yes, Of course. Is everything all right with Clara? The hesitation told me everything. A confident man would not have asked that. A secure fiancé would not have sounded so unsure. He was already afraid of what I might say. Clara had him exactly where she wanted him. Everything is fine, son, I said firmly. I was wondering if you might have time for dinner sometime this week. I would like to get to know you better before the wedding. Dinner? His voice cracked slightly. Yes, of course. When were you thinking? Tomorrow evening. Miller's Steakhouse, 7 o'clock. Another pause. Then, should Clara come too? The question revealed even more. He wanted her there, needed her there, as if he could not face me without her. I pressed my advantage. Just us men, I said. It is time we had a proper conversation. The line went quiet. Finally, he said, All right. Tomorrow, 7 o'clock. I ended the call and sat back in the driver's seat, staring at the Hale building across the street. In the reflection of its glass doors, I saw myself, an aging man in a worn flannel shirt, gripping a notebook full of truths. Tomorrow night, I would walk into that restaurant, sit across from the man about to marry my daughter, and begin my investigation face to face. When I arrived at Miller's Steakhouse, I was 30 minutes early. The place was the kind of establishment where Riverton's powerful families conducted business and celebrated anniversaries. The heavy wooden doors swung open to reveal polished floors that reflected the glow of chandeliers, each table draped in crisp white linens. A line of wine bottles gleamed behind the bar, and waiters in black vests moved like clockwork between the tables. The smell of seared meat and buttered bread filled the air, rich enough to make me acutely aware that I was out of place. I asked for a corner table, somewhere discreet, where no one would overhear us. The hostess gave me a look that said she had measured my cheap shirt and worn shoes in a second, but she led me there without comment. I settled into the chair, my notebook tucked inside my coat pocket, and studied the menu. The prices made my stomach twist. A ribeye steak cost nearly as much as my weekly grocery bill. I ordered only water and waited, my mind running through every angle of the conversation I was about to have. At exactly 7, Richard Jr. walked in. He wore a charcoal gray suit that probably cost more than I earned in a month. His hair was neatly parted, his tie knotted tight, but his posture gave him away. He hesitated at the door, glanced around nervously, and only moved forward when the hostess gestured toward me. His handshake was soft, uncertain, his palm already damp when it met mine. Mr. Thompson, he said, forcing a smile. Thank you for inviting me. Sit, I said, gesturing to the chair across from me. He obeyed immediately, folding his napkin on his lap with mechanical precision. His eyes darted around the room rather than meeting mine, as if looking for escape routes. A waiter appeared, and Richard ordered salmon with a glass of red wine, his voice rehearsed, practiced. I asked only for the cheapest meal on the menu, some grilled chicken, and another glass of water. Once the waiter left, I leaned forward, folding my hands on the table. So, I began, tell me about yourself. How did you and Clara meet? His relief was visible. Small talk, safe territory. He straightened slightly. At the bank, actually. I was there to set up accounts for our expansion. Clara was the financial advisor who helped us restructure. She was very professional, efficient. I nodded, though inwardly I noted the detail. Clara always had a knack for money, particularly when it belonged to someone else. And you fell in love immediately? Richard's fork paused halfway to his mouth. He lowered it carefully, adjusting his napkin again. Clara is remarkable, he said, each word measured. She is beautiful, intelligent, ambitious. My parents are very impressed with her. "That is not what I asked," I said, keeping my voice calm but direct. "I did not ask what your parents think. I asked what you feel." His throat bobbed as he swallowed. His gaze fell to the tablecloth. "Of course I love her. Why would you think otherwise?" "Because you sound like you are trying to convince yourself more than me." The silence that followed was heavy. Other diners clinked glasses, laughed softly. But at our table the air grew thick with tension. Richard twisted his engagement ring around his finger, a nervous tick that betrayed him more than his words. Finally, he whispered, "Love is complicated, Mr. Thompson. Clara says we cannot wait, that we need to marry quickly." "Why so quickly?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. His eyes flicked up to mine, pleading, as though I might understand better than he did. "Because she says I might change my mind." The words hung between us like a dropped blade. I leaned back slowly, my pulse steady, though inside I felt the cold certainty of my suspicions locking into place. Clara was pushing him, manipulating him the same way she had once manipulated Alan. She had found another man too weak to resist, and she was cornering him into vows before he realized he was walking into a trap. But I needed to hear him say it. I needed the confirmation in his own voice. "Change your mind about what exactly?" I asked, my tone low but deliberate. Richard's face paled. He fidgeted with his fork, abandoned it, and reached for his wine instead. His hand shook just enough to ripple the surface in the glass. His lips parted as though to speak, then closed again. Around us, the restaurant carried on with its elegance. But at our table, there was only the weight of a truth he was too afraid to admit. I leaned forward once more, fixing him with the steady gaze of a father who had already lost too much. "Go on, Richard. Say it." His eyes had darted around the restaurant that night, searching for escape, searching for strength he did not have. But I already knew the truth. Clara was pushing him into marriage before his doubts could harden into resistance. I had seen this pattern before. Alan had been her first victim, but Richard was about to become her greatest conquest. The next morning, I sat at my kitchen table with a folder of records spread before me again. The papers seemed endless. Medical bills, payment schedules, surgical notes from the transplant. The black ink spelled out a history of sacrifice few in that glittering Hale family world would ever understand. Each page carried a memory I had lived through. The night I signed away what little savings we had left. The morning I awoke from surgery with a hollowness in my side that I still felt when the weather changed. The nights I sat with my wife's hand in mine while the machines hummed around us. I sorted the documents into careful piles. At the top, I placed the proof of my kidney donation. A letter from the hospital, dated 20 years ago, confirming the surgery. Next, the medical bills, stacked until they formed a small tower on the table. Then the bank statements, showing the steady decline of every account until nothing remained. I touched each stack as though it were sacred. Together, they told a story no one at Clara's wedding wanted to hear, but one I was determined to tell. When the piles were neat, I slipped them into a manila folder and pressed it flat against the table. The folder looked ordinary, unremarkable, but it carried more weight than any diamond necklace, more value than any banquet hall. It was truth, and truth was all I had left to give. The next task came harder. The wedding was a week away, and I had nothing to wear. My best clothes were a pair of pressed slacks and a shirt that had grown thin at the collar. They were fine for Sunday service, but they would not survive the scrutiny of the Hale family's sharp eyes. Clara had already excluded me from the rehearsal dinner. At the ceremony, I knew I would be placed in the shadows. Still, I could not show up looking like a man who had already accepted defeat. I drove into Riverton's main shopping district, the truck wheezing as though protesting the trip. Springfield stores had long since been replaced with polished chains and boutiques that sold suits costing more than my mortgage had ever been. I walked past them until I found a small men's store tucked into a corner. Inside, the air smelled of new fabric and starch. Racks of suits lined the walls, each tagged with numbers that made my stomach sink. A salesman appeared, smiling with the practiced charm of someone who had seen too many fathers like me. "Looking for something special?" he asked. "A suit," I said simply. "For my daughter's wedding." He led me to the clearance rack, where older styles hung, still crisp but already forgotten by the wealthy men who bought new each season. I ran my fingers along the fabric until I found one marked down twice. Navy blue, simple, nothing flashy. $200, the tag read, nearly half my monthly food budget. I swallowed hard and carried it to the fitting room. Inside, the mirror reflected a man who looked older than his 65 years. My hands shook as I buttoned the jacket, the scar along my side tugging with the movement. The suit fit awkwardly, loose in some places and tight in others, but it was the best I could afford. When I stepped out, the salesman tilted his head, a flicker of pity in his eyes before he smoothed it away. "It is a good value," he said gently. I counted out the cash carefully, each bill a small sacrifice. When I left the store, the suit bag slung over my shoulder felt heavier than it should. Driving home, I thought about the luxury vehicles that would fill the Crescent Pavilion parking lot. Mercedes, Cadillacs, BMWs, cars worth more than my entire house. My old truck would be hidden in the back, rusting quietly, a reminder of where I came from. The wedding invitation arrived the next day. Heavy paper, embossed with gold lettering, tied with a silk ribbon. "Mr. David Thompson," it read in elegant script. The card itself probably cost more than my monthly utilities. Inside, the details were printed in shining ink. Crescent Pavilion, 5 o'clock, reception to follow. 300 guests expected. No mention of a rehearsal dinner. No mention of me walking my daughter down the aisle. I set the invitation on the table beside the folder of medical records. The contrast was stark. On one side, luxury. On the other, sacrifice. Clara had chosen her side long ago. The days leading up to the wedding crawled. I tried to keep myself busy with small repairs around the house, tightening hinges, replacing bulbs, anything to keep from thinking too much. But every time I paused, the folder on the table drew my eyes. I knew what it contained. I knew what it would mean to open it in front of hundreds of strangers. But I also knew it was the only way left to remind Clara and everyone else what love truly looked like. The morning of the wedding arrived gray and heavy, the air thick with humidity. I woke before dawn, nerves keeping me from sleep. I laid out the navy suit, pressed it as best I could, and polished my old shoes until the leather gleamed faintly. They were scuffed, worn from years of use, but I did what I could. By noon, I had shaved, combed my thinning hair, and tucked the manila folder carefully into the inside pocket of my jacket. The weight of it rested against my chest like a second heart. At 2 o'clock, I stood in front of the mirror. The man looking back at me was tired, lined with years of struggle, but his eyes were steady. For once, there was no shame in them, only resolve. I picked up a small wrapped box from the counter. Inside was the only gift I could afford. A simple picture frame, silver-plated, bought from the discount aisle at the department store. It had cost me another week's worth of groceries. but I could not walk into that hall empty-handed. I slipped it into my coat pocket beside the folder. When I stepped outside, the air was thick and warm. The truck groaned to life, and I drove toward Crescent Pavilion. As I approached, the building rose before me like a monument to wealth. Its glass walls reflected the river beyond, its entrance lined with fresh white roses. Guests in designer suits and gowns were already arriving, stepping out of gleaming cars, their laughter carrying on the humid air. I parked at the far end of the lot, my truck hidden behind rows of polished vehicles. As I stepped out, the suit clinging awkwardly to my shoulders, I felt the eyes of other guests glance my way before sliding past, uninterested. I walked toward the entrance, clutching the coat where the folder rested against me. At the door, an usher asked, "Bride or groom?" "Bride," I answered. "I am her father." His eyes flickered, surprise quickly replaced by professional composure. "This way, sir." He led me not to the front, but to the back rows, a place reserved for distant relatives and acquaintances. I sat down quietly, surrounded by strangers, the smell of perfume and cologne heavy in the air. From where I sat, I could see the head table, the gleaming crystal, the Hale family already commanding attention with their easy confidence. Clara would walk down the aisle soon, radiant in her gown, and I would be a footnote in her perfect story. But not for long. I slipped a hand inside my coat, felt the edges of the folder beneath my fingers. I leaned closer, my voice a whisper only I could hear. "Tonight, they will hear the truth." The words I whispered to myself stayed lodged in my chest as I sat stiffly in the back row of Crescent Pavilion's grand hall. The place was more magnificent than I had imagined. Crystal chandeliers hung from high ceilings that sparkled with light. The walls were draped with ivory silk, and tall arrangements of white roses lined the aisle. The air smelled of perfume, expensive cologne, and flowers that had been flown in from somewhere far more exotic than Riverton. Every detail announced wealth. Every detail reminded me of how little I belonged here. The seats in the front row were filled with the Hale family, their designer suits and gowns glowing under the lights. Richard Hale Sr. sat at the center, his posture commanding, his face calm, as if this day belonged more to him than to the couple at the altar. Alice, his wife, looked radiant in a jeweled gown, her pearls gleaming with every movement. Around them sat relatives, business partners, and the kinds of people who never had to glance at price tags. And me? I had been led to the back, past distant cousins and barely acquainted business associates, to a chair pressed against the wall near the exit doors. From here, the aisle looked like a river of light I could only observe from its banks, never enter. No usher had asked me if I wished to give my daughter away. No one had asked me anything. I was a guest in the story I had helped write from its first chapter. The music began, filling the hall with solemn chords. Every head turned as Clara appeared at the far end of the aisle. My breath caught despite myself. She looked radiant, every inch the bride she had always dreamed of being. The silk gown shimmered as she moved, the diamond bracelet on her wrist scattering light across the crowd. Her smile was poised, controlled, a mask she wore so well now that I wondered if even she believed it. My body moved instinctively to rise, to prepare myself to walk her down the aisle, to do what a father does. But before I could straighten fully, I saw Richard Hale Sr. stand. The officiant nodded at him, and with smooth confidence, he stepped forward, offering his arm to Clara. She took it without hesitation, relief flooding her face. Together, they walked down the aisle while guests sighed in admiration. "Her family and I do," Richard Sr. said firmly when asked who gave her away. His voice carried through the hall, steady and strong. Applause rippled from the crowd, approving, touched by the gesture. Clara smiled up at him, gratitude shining in her eyes, not once glancing back at me in the shadows. The ceremony passed in a blur. I watched my daughter vow to honor and cherish a man she had no intention of cherishing. Watched Richard Jr. slip the ring onto her finger with trembling hands. Watched the officiant pronounce them husband and wife, while cameras flashed from every angle. To the rest of the world, it looked perfect. To me, it looked like the careful closing of a trap. When the ceremony ended, the crowd flowed into the reception hall. I followed quietly, my gift tucked under my arm, the manila folder still heavy against my chest inside my coat. The reception space was even more extravagant than the ceremony. Crystal chandeliers reflected in the polished floors, while silver settings gleamed on tables draped in white linen. The head table sat on a raised platform at the far end of the room, commanding attention like a throne. Clara sat between Richard Jr. and his father, her smile fixed, her posture regal. I was directed to table 12 again, near the kitchen doors. Around me sat acquaintances and distant relations, people too far from the center to matter. The meal began, course after course delivered by waiters in crisp uniforms. Plates of food more elaborate than anything I had ever eaten in my life were set before us. Roasted duck, imported cheeses, desserts that looked like art. I picked at the portions, my appetite gone, my eyes fixed on the head table. The toasts began with Richard Hale Sr. He stood easily, commanding the room with the confidence of a man used to speaking to crowds. His voice was rich, his words smooth. He praised Clara for her intelligence, her beauty, her ability to fit perfectly into the Hale family. He spoke of gaining a daughter who understood their values, a woman who would continue the family's legacy with grace. The crowd erupted into applause, nodding and murmuring approval. Clara looked at him with admiration, so warm it made my stomach turn. Alice Hale stood next, tears glistening in her eyes as she spoke. She talked about how she had always dreamed of having a daughter, how Clara had already brought joy into their family, how she could not wait for the years ahead. Her voice broke slightly, and the guests sighed in sympathy. Again, applause filled the room, louder this time, touched by her emotion. Clara leaned against her new mother-in-law, her expression soft, her hand resting over Alice's in a gesture of gratitude. I sat frozen in my chair. Not once had anyone mentioned me. Not once had anyone acknowledged that I existed. It was as though Clara had erased me entirely, replacing me with the family she believed she deserved. My hand tightened around the stem of my water glass until it creaked in protest. Finally, it was Clara's turn. She rose from her seat, her champagne flute in hand, her gown glittering under the chandeliers. Every camera in the room swung toward her. Every guest leaned forward expectantly. The photographers adjusted their lenses, knowing this would be the moment people remembered. Clara lifted her glass high, her smile wide and radiant. "I want to raise a toast," she began, her voice strong, clear. The room hushed instantly, 300 people hanging on her every word. My chest tightened as I waited, though I already knew what was coming. "To someone very special. Tonight," she said, "the man who gave me a chance at a new beginning, who showed me what real family support looks like." She turned toward Richard Hale Sr., her voice warm, her eyes shining with sincerity. "To my real father." Gasps rippled through the room. My heart dropped, though I had known it would. She raised her glass directly toward him, her meaning unmistakable. The crowd erupted in applause, the chandeliers catching the sparkle of her bracelet as she clinked her glass against his. Richard Sr. stood, his face glowing with pride as he embraced her. "To my real father," Clara repeated, her voice ringing over the celebration. The applause surged again, filling the reception hall like thunder rolling across the sky. I sat frozen in my chair at table 12, my water glass slick in my hand. Every guest stood clapping, some dabbing at their eyes, others nodding in admiration at the touching tribute they believed they had just witnessed. The cameras flashed, capturing the moment Clara crowned another man as the father who mattered most. And then I stood. The scraping of my chair against the polished floor cut through the noise. Heads turned, conversations faltered, and the applause weakened until it was no more than scattered claps echoing in the sudden quiet. I felt the weight of hundreds of eyes settle on me, the forgotten man at the edge of the room, rising at last. My knees trembled slightly, but my voice, when it came, was steady. "I would like to make a toast as well," I said, then raising my water glass. Not crystal, not champagne, just water in a plain tumbler. But the silence that followed gave it more gravity than any gold or jewel could have. Clara froze, her glass still raised toward Richard Hale Sr. For the first time all day, she looked directly at me. Her smile faltered, her eyes narrowing in fear. She knew. She had always known this day might come. I took a step forward, my voice carrying clear across the hall. "I want to raise a glass to something real, to love that does not measure itself in bank accounts or banquet halls, to love that does not disappear when the money runs out." The room was still. Even the waiters had stopped moving, trays balanced in their hands, watching. I slipped a hand inside my jacket and felt the folder there, the paper edges pressing against my palm. "When Clara was 5 years old," I said, my voice firm, "she was dying. Her kidneys were failing, and without a transplant, she would not have seen her 6th birthday." A collective gasp rippled across the room. Clara's glass trembled in her hand. Richard Jr. glanced at her, his face pale, his mouth slightly open. "I was her match," I continued. "I gave her one of mine. I lay on an operating table willing to risk my own life so she could live. And she did. She survived because of me." The silence was absolute now, heavy, electric. All eyes turned toward Clara, then back to me. Her face drained of color, her lips parting as though to speak, but no words came. "The surgery nearly killed me," I said, my voice rising with every word. "The recovery cost us everything we had, every penny of savings, every dollar borrowed, every late-night shift at the repair shop. I went into debt so deep I am still climbing out. I gave my health, my money, my years, and I never asked for thanks. Because that is what real love does. It sacrifices without keeping score." The folder came out then, my hand steady as I opened it and lifted the papers high. Here are the records, hospital letters, bills, payment plans signed with shaking hands. Proof that the life you see standing at that head table exists because her father, her real father, bled and broke himself to give it to her. Murmurs swelled into outrage. Guests whispered fiercely to one another. A woman at the table beside me pressed a hand to her mouth, her eyes wide. An older man shook his head in disgust. Richard Hale Sr. shifted uncomfortably, his confident mask slipping. Alice dabbed at her eyes, her face stricken. And Richard Jr. sat motionless, his fork abandoned, staring at the woman he had just married as though seeing her for the first time. Clara tried to speak then, her voice shrill. That was a long time ago. But I cut her off, my voice booming louder than I thought possible. There is no expiration date on sacrifice. I slammed my hand against the table, and the sound echoed through the hall. I gave her life twice. Once the day she was born, and once the day I gave her my kidney. And tonight she stands before you, toasting another man, erasing me, pretending history never happened. But you know the truth now. You all know. The room erupted, not in anger at me, but in applause. Slow at first, hesitant, then building until it roared like thunder. Guests rose from their seats, clapping, some shouting words I could not hear over the sound. The applause swelled, drowning out Clara's protests, shaking the chandeliers overhead. Clara's face crumbled, her flawless mask shattered under the weight of 300 eyes judging her, condemning her. She clutched at Richard Jr.'s arm, her voice frantic now. We have to leave. Right now. Richard Jr. pulled his arm away, his eyes locked on me. Is it true? He asked her, his voice hollow. Did your father really give you his kidney? It does not matter, she hissed, her desperation plain. They are all staring at us. We have to go. But the guests were not just staring. They were whispering words that cut sharper than any blade. Ungrateful. Shameful. How could she? The condemnation spread like fire, and Clara's shoulders hunched under it. She dragged at Richard Jr.'s sleeve, but he resisted, torn between loyalty to her and the truth he could no longer ignore. Finally, he stood, his chair scraping back. Together, they moved quickly toward the exit, Clara's gown snagging on, chair legs as they passed. Guests pulled back to let them through, but not without shaking their heads or muttering their disgust. The applause continued, now directed entirely at me. Where are you going? Richard Sr. called after them, his voice strained. This is your wedding. Richard Jr. did not answer. He could not meet his father's eyes. Clara's face burned red as they fled the hall, the photographers lowering their cameras, unsure whether to capture the humiliation or let it pass. The doors closed behind them with a dull thud, leaving behind the echo of their flight. The applause did not stop. Strangers came to my table, shaking my hand, clapping me on the back, telling me I was the true father, the real man of the night. For the first time in decades, I felt dignity return. Not wealth, not luxury, but respect, the kind that comes from truth finally spoken aloud. Later, when the reception wound down, I left quietly. I drove my old truck through Riverton's quiet streets, the folder of documents still beside me. The suit clung to me awkwardly, but I no longer cared. For once, the weight on my chest felt lighter. In the days that followed, the calls began. Old neighbors, acquaintances, even people I barely knew reached out to tell me they had been there, that they had witnessed what Clara had tried to bury. Some told me I was a hero. Others said I had done what every father dreams of, protecting his family, even when it hurt. I thanked them all, but inside I knew this had never been about recognition. It had been about truth. Clara never called, not once. I did not expect her to. She had made her choice. She had chosen wealth over family, status over sacrifice. But I had made my choice too, and mine was to stop letting her lie about the cost of her life. That night at Crescent Pavilion, I gave my daughter life a second time. The first had been with my kidney, with the blood and pain and years it cost me. The second had been with truth, spoken clearly enough to pierce the glittering lies she had wrapped herself in. Whether she chose to use that gift was no longer my burden. I had finally kept the promise I made to her mother years ago. when we stood together at our wedding altar, whispering vows of loyalty and sacrifice. I had promised to protect our family's values, no matter how hard the world tried to strip them away. And I had done it, even if it meant losing the daughter who no longer recognized me. The night ended not with bitterness, but with peace. A quiet, steady peace that filled my home as I hung the suit in the closet and sat down in the chair my wife once loved. Outside the window, Riverton's lights shimmered like distant stars, each one a reminder that sacrifice, though often invisible, is what gives life its truest worth. I had been erased at my daughter's wedding, but in the end, it was her mask that crumbled, not mine. And for the first time in years, I felt whole again. If you liked this story, please subscribe to the channel and tell us your thoughts in the comments. What would you have done if your daughter had stood at her wedding and called another man her real father? To hear the next story, click on the box on your screen.